Before proceeding with the questioning of our witness, I'd like to make two announcements. I'm pleased to announce that the committees have reached an agreement with the government of Israel under which we will obtain significant new information for our investigation. The Israeli government will provide us with financial and other detailed information relating to the Iran arms sale. Our staffs have already seen some of the information assembled by the government of Israel, and we are satisfied that it reveals important facts. In addition, the committees will be able to interview General Raphael Vadi, who has led the Israeli government's fact-gathering in this matter. We will be free to present the information publicly in an appropriate form and to use it to cross-examine witnesses before us. The principal restriction on this use is the same that the United States imposes on use of its own classified material. We will not publicly disclose information that would affect national security. The committees wish to express our great appreciation for the unique cooperation being extended by a sovereign nation at this vital stage of our inquiry. Without such voluntary assistance, relevant facts would not be available to us or to the public. And without these facts, our investigation could not be considered complete. Further, in connection with Mr. Cooper's testimony this morning, we are releasing this morning the deposition testimony taken by our staff of the legal advisor of the State Department, the Honorable Abraham D. Safir. Do you wish to say something?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just concur in your statement with regard to the agreement reached with the government of Israel and join you in expressing appreciation to the government of Israel for their cooperation.
Our first witness this morning will be Mr. Charles Cooper. Mr. Cooper, will you please rise? Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Leon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Cooper.
Good afternoon.
If I may, I'd like to start off by going back over some of the questions, some of the topic areas that you were questioned about earlier to amplify and clarify a few points, if I may. First of all, with regard to the chronologies, I believe you testified that there were a number of chronologies that came into your possession and your office's possession over this two-week time period, roughly, and you turned them over to us, did you not?
We certainly turned over all chronologies that came into our possession from whatever source. I think there were at least 3 different versions of the chronology.
Okay. And is it also your testimony that with regard to the chronologies, you did not find yourself constantly comparing them line by line, so to speak?
That's correct. I did not do that.
Is that because you viewed them as being a dynamic, something that was constantly evolving and being added to as a result of the work that was going on behind the scenes at the NSC to bring new facts to life?
It was my understanding that the effort at NSC was one that was obviously ongoing. It was hectic, and that the chronology, each succeeding chronology that we received, was a representation of their better and more perfect understanding of the facts.
And certainly prior to the events of November 20th, you had no reason, did you, to suspect that there was anything inherently wrong with those chronologies, or there was any effort being made to misstate the facts in them in any way, shape, or form?
I perceive no reason to believe that. I entertain no such suspicion.
In fact, after you left the meeting on the 20th with the Attorney General, and you were heading back to your office when you got detoured to go over to Mr. Wallace's office, you were proceeding, were you not, on the assumption that the chronology you had as of that date was pretty much a complete one and that you could almost rely on that alone to finish up your legal analyses of the issues?
I was satisfied that the individuals were confident of the state of the facts that they had developed and had presented.
Now, you testified that after you left that meeting, you went over to meet with Mr. Wallison. Isn't that correct?
That's right.
And when you got there, Mr. Wallison expressed some concern on his part about his not having been invited to that earlier meeting that afternoon, hadn't he?
He did. I don't think in my earlier testimony that it was entirely clear that Mr. Thompson was with me and
Right.
accompanied me to Mr. Wallison's office. But there were three of us in the office, and Mr. Wallison did indeed take the opportunity to make those points to Mr. Thompson.
Now, was it your sense that the White House counsel's office had been, so to speak, frozen out of that meeting earlier that day?
I wouldn't quarrel with that.
Now, you spoke with Mr. Wallison, and Judge Sofair called, and during the course of the conversation, you became aware of the conflict, potential conflict between Secretary Schultz's version of events and Mr. McFarlane's. And you shared that with Mr. Wallison, did you not?
With Mr. Wallison?
Right.
Actually, it was Mr. Wallison who shared it with me. He's the one who had the secure telephone conversation with Mr. Sofair, though, as I say, I don't think he did not fully perceive the significance of the information that he was passing to us. I perceived the significance of it.
Do you have any knowledge as to whether he passed that information on, that potential conflict, to Donald Regan?
I have no knowledge of that at all.
Did the Attorney General give you any indication when he met with Donald Regan and the President the following morning that Donald Regan seemed to be aware of the conflict that he, the Attorney General, was at that time bringing to the attention of the President?
I don't remember having received any information on that question.
Now, moving to the afternoon of the 21st, in your interview with Mr. McFarlane, you testified you were present, you took notes, and your notes are an exhibit here. Now, with regard to that exhibit, Exhibit 15, I would direct your attention to the fourth page of those notes. In Exhibit 15, in the upper right corner, there's a number, a document identification number 3096. Do you have that in front of you?
Yes, sir.
I would direct your attention to the, about 3/4 of the way down the page, Mr. Cooper, there's an entry for December 7th that starts off with M said we should, and then something's crossed out, provide arms, no talk regarding problem with arms already given by Israel. Looks like that.
Right.
These are your notes, are they not?
They are.
And I wanted to ask you if, upon reviewing these notes at a later time, that you reached any conclusion as to whether or not that statement that I just referred you to was incomplete or incorrect in any way.
Yes, my note is incorrect.
How would you like to amend that today?
The note says, McFarlane said we should provide arms, blah, blah, blah. But it was McFarlane's position throughout our interview that he had consistently recommended in the various meetings and in all his many counsels on this with the President and others that we not provide arms. And the rest of my notes are consistent with that view. This is a mistake on my part. The word not is omitted, but there was not an occasion in our interview in which Mr. McFarlane suggests that he had recommended that we provide arms.
And you have an independent recollection of that word not being included in there?
Oh, yes.
And
Yes.
you've testified to that in your depositions previously before the committee's counsel?
As well as before other bodies.
Okay, fine. Now, with regard to one further aspect of that interview that afternoon, Mr. Cooper, you've testified to an aside between the Attorney General and Mr. McFarlane after the meeting took place, and that the Attorney General later shared with you, the contents of which. And I believe you testified as to what it was that McFarlane said to the Attorney General, and you paraphrased it along the lines of his desire to help the President and to protect the interests of the President, words to that effect. I don't believe you testified as to what the Attorney General told you his reaction was and what he said to Mr. McFarlane after Mr. McFarlane said that to him.
Yes, perhaps I didn't, but I do have a equally general recollection that that the Attorney General reiterated at that point for Mr. McFarland what he had opened our interview with, which was that the way to assist and protect the interests of the President in this matter is to be entirely forthcoming and to not engage in any activity that could be interpreted as an effort to conceal facts.
Okay. Now, the following morning when you interviewed Secretary Schultz together with the Attorney General, was that the first time you'd met the Secretary personally?
Yes, it was.
Okay. And that was over at the State Department, was it not, at his offices?
Yes.
Now, I believe you've testified as to what Secretary Schultz told the Attorney General and yourself with regard to Mr. McFarland's statement to him as to the Hawk missiles. I don't recall you testifying as to what Secretary Schultz told you his reaction was to Mr. McFarland upon learning that there were Hawk missiles about to be shipped from Israel to Iran.
Secretary Schultz maintained then that he disapproved of the idea and that he did not think it would work and that it was a bad idea. He registered his position, was my understanding, and that was that.
Do you register it with Mr. McFarland alone, as far as you know?
That's my understanding, yes.
And did he, the Secretary, give you and the Attorney General the impression that he believed at that time that this was a fait accompli?
No, the transfer itself, I don't think he believed at that point was a fait accompli. I think he was being informed that the transfer was in the offing. Perhaps it was beyond recall, and he may well have had that impression. But he also stressed that he did not understand from the context and statements in the meeting that he was being asked for approval on it, but rather being informed.
Now, with respect to the diversion memorandum and the informing of the Attorney General of the existence of that memorandum on Saturday morning, would you characterize the Attorney General's reaction to learning that, besides what he said, one of proceeding cautiously to determine the truth or falsity of the memorandum and where exactly it had gone?
Well, first, I don't think it was Saturday morning. I'm pretty sure
Saturday
it wasn't
lunch, I
till-
should say.
Right, Saturday early afternoon, lunchtime. I have only a general recollection that first, I've already expressed my recollection of his reaction and his surprise. And beyond that, I do recall him expressing a sense of very serious concern and worry, and obviously the need to verify whether or not this event actually happened.
Do you think it would have been premature at that point for the Attorney General to change an internal investigation, which is what you were conducting at that point, into a criminal investigation based upon a memorandum undated and unaddressed?
Well, I don't know whether, I can't imagine that would have been something that was indicated or required at the moment, whether it would have been, I've forgotten the formulation you used, but, you know, there was just, it didn't occur to me, and I must suspect it didn't even remotely occur to anybody that a criminal investigation of the West Wing of the White House be launched based upon that tentative information. The first thing was to confirm with Mr. North whether or not the event had taken place, and we obviously recognize that would be one of the most important elements of our conversation with Mr. North.
For that matter, did you see any, just on the existence of that memorandum alone, did you have any clear legal theory in your mind as to whether or not there would be any criminal consequences to such a memorandum?
No, none at all, although there were legal implications. We were at least, I was at least, I should say, sensitive to the fact, or at least the great likelihood that there were legal implications for this. I was familiar in a nodding way with the Boland Act and what have you. But I think the Attorney General probably was more sensitive than I was to the potential legal implications at that moment, because he was more familiar, I'm sure, with the Boland Act than I was.
Now, when you met with Colonel North on Sunday afternoon, following afternoon, you've already testified that he had made a joking or passing reference to your colleagues, Reynolds and Richards, with regard to having an attorney. Did that issue of his having an attorney come up at all on Sunday afternoon?
No.
Do you
Not to my recollection, it didn't.
Do you recall any statement to the effect by Oliver North throughout that interview on Sunday afternoon? Any statement to the effect, after being shown the diversion memo, any statement to the effect that, does this count since you haven't given me my rights?
No, I do not recall any such statement to that effect.
Do you recall him making any reference to either wanting his rights, so to speak, or not having gotten his rights?
Nothing of that kind, even remotely resembling that kind of remark or reference, was made in my recollection.
And it's not included in the notes of that afternoon that you've reviewed, is it?
No, it's, well, if it is, I missed it. I don't think that it is. It's not in my recollection.
Now, with respect to your chronology, Exhibit 1, I believe you have before you, I'd like to solidify a date with regard to an event that you testified to earlier today. If you turn your attention to your chronology on the 4th page, I believe it is, might be actually 6th page. It's got the number in the upper right corner, J7699.
What's the date on that, Counsel?
It'll be November 25th's events.
Yes, sir.
There's a reference in the chronology to a meeting on November 25th at 2:30 in the afternoon, a meeting with the Attorney General, yourself, Brad Reynolds, Stephen Trott, Judge Webster, and Arnold Burns. Is that the meeting you were referring to earlier today as when the Attorney General assigned Mr. Burns the responsibility of securing the documents?
Yeah, it is. It's my recollection that that's when that directive was issued.
So that was on Tuesday, the 25th.
That's my best recollection.
And turning back one page, you have a reference to a meeting later that day at 5:45 to 7 o'clock that was misplaced on November 24th with the Attorney General, Stephen Trott, Bill Weld, and others.
That's
Would
right.
that be the meeting you referred to in which Mr. Burns noted that he had not yet done what the Attorney General expected him to do?
Well, yes, I think that is the meeting, although I note that my chronology doesn't reflect that Mr. Burns was there, but that's my best
It
recollection.
was clearly the same day, was it not?
I can't say that. I can't accede to the term clearly. It is my best recollection, and it's reasonably confident, but it's not clear to me.
What was the Attorney General's reaction as you perceived it to learning that Mr. Burns had either misunderstood his orders or had failed to carry them out?
I obviously feel awkward discussing this, but Mr. Burns was embarrassed, and he felt very badly because the Attorney General was, he exhibited a rare flash of irritation at that. And Mr. Burns immediately exited to accomplish the task.
Now, focusing back on the events of the weekend, did you at any time or any members of the investigation team have any reason to think that the diversion memorandum or any other documents that you reviewed were about to be or in jeopardy of being shredded, altered, or destroyed in any way, shape, or form?
We had no basis at all. I entertained no suspicion of that.
And was it ever discussed even as a possibility among the four of you?
It is my vague recollection that there was some joking between us, or at least perhaps me and John Richardson or Brad, not to the effect that there were documents being shredded, but perhaps that the documents had been examined or were incomplete in their production. But as I say, we did not have any basis for suspicion of that fact and entertained no idea of any such activity.
Okay, fine. Now, I've placed before you a copy of a transcript that's unclassified of Judge Sofair that was referred to earlier in your testimony today. I'd like you to take that so you can follow along with me. This is a transcript of a deposition taken on June 18th. Now, had you ever seen this before today?
This deposition transcript?
Yeah.
No, I have not.
Okay, and I would like you to direct your attention to pages 69 to 70, which contain a reference in Judge Sofair's testimony to a conversation between you and him on Sunday evening, the 23rd. And if I direct your attention to line 14, would like to read that into the record, if you care to follow along, with regard to Judge Sofair's account of his conversation with you that evening, and then ask you if this comports with your recollection of that event. Answer by Judge Sofair. Yes, November 23rd, I was interested in knowing where the investigation stood, and Cooper was interested in seeing the notes. So we were on the phone together. I don't know who called, but we were probably calling each other. He said, have you arranged to make sure that I can get to see the notes? And I said, don't worry, I'll see to it. Let me stop there for a second. The notes he's referring to are Mr. Charles Hill's notes, the Executive Assistant to the Secretary of State, are they not?
I'm certain that's true.
Picking it back up on line 20. And I asked, how did it go with the Secretary, and how is it going generally? He was exhausted, I could tell from his voice. It was late at night on Sunday, and he said it's just a real mess and that they had found out a lot of things. And he asked me, he mentioned that I had mentioned earlier that I was concerned about a surplus of funds. Question, how did he know that? Answer, I had mentioned it to him. Question, to Cooper? Answer, sure. And he said, how did you know about that? What had led you to that? And I explained to him that I just thought there was a spread, that cost price and sale price might be very different. He didn't say anything, but he led me to believe that that might be significant in the story. He did not explain to me what had happened. Question, Cooper didn't tell you on the 23rd that the day before representatives of the Attorney General had found the so-called diversion evidence? Answer, no, he didn't at that time. I told him that, at a minimum, I was scared that Southern Air Transport had been given a lot of money for its arms shipments to the Middle East to subsidize it, in effect for doing the work it was doing in Central America for the FDN. Question, but these were concerns that you were generating based on inferences. You at that time knew nothing about the fact of any diversion from the Iran program to Contras or elsewhere. Answer, not until the Attorney General's press conference. Question, on the 25th of November, answer, yes. Having reviewed that, Mr. Cooper, does that sound consistent with your recollection of your telephone conversation with Judge Sofair on the evening of the 23rd?
It does. It sounds remarkably familiar, in fact.
He comments in his transcript that you sounded exhausted on that evening, were you?
Yes, I was.
It had been a strenuous few days before that, or weeks?
Yes, it had.
There had been a lot of firsts for you during that time period. Your first meeting with Mr. Poindexter, I believe you testified, with Mr. Casey, Mr. Schultz. The first time you'd ever seen a finding. Your first exposure to a lot of documents that you'd never seen before at the National Security Council, isn't that correct?
That's true.
Was it the first time you'd ever been involved in an investigation of this kind?
Of this kind, yes.
Would you say that was a baptism by fire?
I would not quarrel with that characterization.
Would you say that the hours have been very long and arduous on each day?
I would consider that an understatement.
And that it was a complex set of events?
That is quite true.
Would you say, and it was a little bit, to draw an analogy, a little bit like navigating down an unknown river in a small boat, where there are new twists and turns around each bend, and the pace of the river kept escalating as you went along?
All of those things sound quite descriptive and accurate to me.
Let's go over some of those facts that were revealed to you in a very short period of time. On the 17th, your investigation, up to that point, the 17th, was just into the Hawk shipments, was it not?
The Hawk shipments,
Pre-January events?
the pre-January events, right?
And on the-
September and November.
And on the 17th, for the first time, you learned about pre-January events, was it not, when you got the chronology?
Yes, I believe it was.
And on the 19th, the President had a press conference where there was an error that you brought to the attention of the White House staff, did you not?
That is correct. In the President's press conference, I'm certain all will recall was one in which the President was apparently not very well briefed by his staff. That was certainly my conclusion. That was a conclusion and a very serious concern of the Attorney General.
And the Attorney General was so concerned about it that he made it a fact to be there the next day to ensure that the testimony that was anticipated on Friday next would be consistent and factually accurate.
That was part of his motivation.
And later that afternoon, it came to your attention not only 2 days after learning about the pre-January events for the first time, you learned about a major conflict between cabinet officers, did you not?
Yes.
And that certainly was a major revelation and a major new concern, was it not?
Yes, it was indeed.
And the next afternoon, after the President gave you the green light to conduct an internal investigation, and you only had 72 hours to do it in, you had the testimony of Mr. McFarland to you that you yourself said raised serious questions of credibility. And that was a major concern, was it not, that escalated the pace of the events?
It did.
And then lunch the very next day, now only 3 days into this, you had another major revelation of an even greater proportion. I think you once described it as a nuclear type of problem.
It had that potential.
And now you had only 48 hours to resolve all of these matters to report to the President in the next 2 days. And the next,
At this point, I became quite seriously doubtful that we could resolve these matters in that period of time.
and the very next day, you had an interview with Colonel North in which he confirmed many of the fears that you recognized just the preceding day when that bombshell exploded at the luncheon. Did he not?
Yes.
Raising serious questions with regard to high government officials surrounding the President.
Yes.
Well, I go through these points, Mr. Cooper, because I want to give you an opportunity to state, as I close now, some sense of context in which these events were transpiring and how you felt, because there will be Monday morning quarterbacking, I'm sure, by historians for years to come as to these events and your participation in them and other people's participation in them. The Attorney General was at the helm of this boat, and you were there with him at his side, and I think it's important for you to have the opportunity to express some sense to this committee of what it was like to be in the middle of that very fast-whirling set of events. Why don't you take that opportunity?
Well, you're most kind to afford it to me. However, out of respect for the time of this committee, I would simply say that I do believe that the flavor for the moment, so to speak, that you have really just provided is quite accurate, and throughout this period, I think we all acted with a sense of grave urgency, and urgency that seemed to become graver and graver with each passing interview, with each passing moment, and I think we acted with a very serious concern about the events that would undoubtedly follow in train, as they certainly have followed in train, and the period that our country and the American people would go through in consequence of it. But beyond that, I really have little more to say about it.
It certainly wasn't an experience you expected to have when you were confirmed as an Assistant Attorney General by the Senate a little over a year ago, was it?
No, I did not expect any such experience as this.
Is it your testimony today that you did your very best at every stage along that process?
And that is certainly my testimony.
I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Kaplan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cooper, I've been told that I'm going to get a medal if I limit my questioning to under 10 minutes. Well, since I've never received a medal either from the Congress or from the Department of Justice, I'm going to do my best to meet that challenge. I want to direct your attention to a meeting that you had with Thomas Green, an attorney here in Washington, on Monday, November 24.
Yes, sir.
How did that meeting come about?
The meeting was set up by Mr. Green, who contacted Brad Reynolds and asked if he could come in and talk with him about the Iran initiative. I think he contacted him Monday morning or something like that. It was
to your knowledge, why did Mr. Green contact Brad Reynolds?
He contacted him because he, at least he represented, he wanted to give us some information that it was important for us to have.
Mm-hmm. Did Mr. Green know Mr. Reynolds, or Mr. Reynolds know Mr. Green prior to that morning contact?
Yes, they were both and are D.C. lawyers. They had litigated against each other, as I understand it, and had litigated on the same side as well. So they were well acquainted with each other, and they had, as I understood it, they were, had high professional and personal regard for one another.
Did Green say how he knew that the Justice Department was conducting a fact-finding inquiry into the Iranian arms initiative?
In his meeting with Mr. Reynolds on Monday?
Well, in the discussion with Mr. Reynolds or in the meeting with you later on that day?
Actually, I don't know what else may have transpired in the discussion with Mr. Reynolds over the telephone, other than what I've made known. In terms of the meeting, I attended the meeting that did ensue on Monday, and I don't recall him stating specifically anything that answered your question, but there were many references wherein it was quite obvious that he had talked with Colonel North, since the time we had, and we had spoken with him the evening before. And it was also clear that, and he indicated he had been talking with North and Secord for a period of time.
Mm-hmm. When did the meeting actually occur?
It was Monday, as I recall. Monday at Monday, according to my chronology, and this squares with my memory, 2 o'clock to in the neighborhood of 3:15, according to my chronology.
Did the meeting take place at the Department of Justice?
Yes, it did.
And who was present at the meeting?
I was, Mr. Green, and Mr. Reynolds.
Did Green say who, if anybody, he was representing in connection with that meeting?
He opened his presentation with the statement that he represents or represented North and Secord. At that point, however, and he wanted to make it clear to us that he was not there in the capacity of a lawyer representing a client. And in fact, he was rather cagey, and that's my word, but it was just not clear to me exactly who it was that he did represent as a lawyer, if anybody. But by the same token, it became quite clear to me he had been discussing this matter with at least North and Secord, and probably Mr. Hakim as well. And in fact, I felt certain and received information that at that time that he discussed this matter with Mr. Hakim, or at least that appeared clear to me. So that's about what the exchange was on his status.
Is it fair to say then that it was at best unclear whether he was representing anybody during that meeting, and possibly he was appearing as a legal representative of no one at all?
Well, it was clear to me that he was not there as a lawyer to a client. He might have been, at the time he was there, representing people, but on that I was unclear. But it was clear that he was not there as a lawyer representing a client. He wanted to make that clear to us.
Can we take that explanation as a clarification of your handwritten notes of the meeting that appear as Exhibit CJC 19?
Yes, you may. Yes, you may.
Can you describe for us the substance of the meeting?
Well, again, I would, I have very little from memory that supplements my notes, although certainly that exchange we just had does. But Mr. Green presented an understanding of the thing that sticks out in my memory, an understanding of the Contra diversion that was at odds with the one that we had received from Colonel North. And he opened his discussion of that element of it by saying that Colonel North is, you know, your ultimate Marine, and he wants to step forward and take the spears in his own chest. And I think that's the formulation he used. It sticks in my mind. But that it's important for us to know that there's another a little different version of this whole matter.
And was there any resolution to the meeting? How did you leave things after Green went through an explanation of his knowledge of the diversion and of the participation of North Seacourt and Hakeem as evidenced by your notes?
There was the conclusion of it, at least on this part, was along the lines that this matter, if made public, this contra element of it all, would be there could be lives lost, and he expressed an earnest hope that it would not be necessary to make it public.
Did you or Mr. Reynolds make any representations to Mr. Green in that regard?
There was an understanding reached. We certainly did not respond one way or another to that point. But Brad did assure Mr. Green, as I recall, that he would do him the courtesy of letting him know prior to the time that the matter was made public.
And what was done by you or Mr. Reynolds with the information that Mr. Green conveyed to you during that meeting Monday afternoon?
We outlined it to the Attorney General and probably to others in the room. I don't remember who was gathered on that occasion, but we did. I do recall in the Attorney General's office outlining the alternative version.
Were any recommendations made to the Attorney General on the basis of the information you received from Green?
I don't recall any, none in particular. You might be able to refresh my memory, however.
Do you know whether Mr. Reynolds did in fact call Mr. Green prior to the disclosure of the diversion on Tuesday, November 25?
No, he didn't.
He did not.
Right.
Are you aware of any further meetings between Justice Department officials and Mr. Green relating to the matters at hand in these hearings?
Yes, I understand that Mr. Reynolds met again with Mr. Green and someone else from the Justice Department some few days later. I don't remember, however. I was not present, and I just don't know what transpired at that meeting.
And you don't know anything about what transpired at that meeting?
I certainly don't recall what transpired.
Okay. What about other phone conversations that you or Mr. Reynolds had with, or might have had with Mr. Green sometime in between the two meetings? Were there any?
Well, there certainly were no phone conversations between me and Mr. Green.
Mm-hmm.
But I know of no conversations that Brad Reynolds had with Mr. Green.
Okay. Now I'm going to direct your attention to a telephone call that I believe you received from Mr. Casey on Monday or Tuesday, November 24 or 25. It's reflected in your notes as Tuesday evening in Exhibit CJC1. Do you actually recall which day that telephone call came in?
I can't improve my chronology on that. The chronology reflects some uncertainty even when I wrote this entry.
Right.
And my memory hasn't improved on that.
What time of day did the call come?
It was in the evening.
Evening.
It was
And
in the evening. It was dark outside. That much I do remember.
Where did he reach you?
In my office.
In your office. Was anyone else in your office at the time the call came in?
Yes, there was.
Who was that?
At least John McGinnis. And I don't know of anybody else, but it's possible that somebody else was.
Are you aware as to whether there was anyone else on Casey's side of the line?
No, I have no knowledge of that.
Okay. Was it common for Casey to call you directly?
No, it was not.
Okay.
Never happened.
But before that evening, approximately how many times had Mr. Casey called you directly?
I had never received a telephone call from Mr. Casey.
And can you describe the substance of the conversation that you and Mr. Casey had?
It was a very, very brief and, well, it was just a very brief conversation. He asked me whether in all of this research we were doing, if we had come across the name Lakeside Resources. Or at least that's what I understood him to say, and that's what I recalled him to say when I wrote this entry.
Mm-hmm. And what was your response?
My response was, that name has some vague familiarity to me, but I'll be darned if I could tell him whether I had or not. It seemed familiar, but I couldn't place it.
Was there any other conversation prior to him hanging up?
I feel confident, and I said, well, is this something that, I mean, why do you want to know that? And I don't remember getting any edifying response.
Okay. I think I've earned my medals. I don't have any further questions, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Cooper, thanks very much for your cooperation today.
Thank you, sir.
Chairman Rodino.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Cooper.
Good afternoon, sir.
Mr. Cooper, I'm trying to settle in my mind the team that was put together by Attorney General Meese. On the afternoon of November 21st, testifying before the Senate committee, he stated that he had assembled a team of 3 lawyers who had experience with this type of matter to conduct the inquiry into the Iran arms sales matter. Now, besides you, there was Assistant Attorney General Bradford Reynolds, is that correct?
Yes.
And Special Assistant to the Attorney General John Richardson, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, all of you are not career employees, you're political employees, are you not?
Yes, sir.
And neither you nor Mr. Reynolds nor Mr. Richardson have worked in the criminal division, is that correct?
Yes, I don't believe any one of us has worked in the criminal division.
As a matter of fact, Mr. Reynolds is the head of the Civil Rights Division, is that not correct?
Yes, sir, he is.
So is it fair to say that none of you really had any extensive experience investigating in matters dealing with national security issues or who had any particular expertise in the matter of Iran or Central America? Isn't that fair to say?
I think that's fair to say, but I don't think the inference to be drawn is fair because the question that we were trying to get at was, who knew what on November?
Well, did it turn out to be who knew what?
Oh, no, it certainly didn't. No, but when this...
As a matter of fact, I think it was Mr. Leon have characterized your experience here as a baptism in fire, your first experience. Isn't that right? Since you really haven't had any extensive investigative experience.
Mr. Chairman, Chairman Rodino, I think that all four of us got a baptism in fire that weekend. I think the Attorney General, who is a very experienced prosecutor and criminal prosecutor, has never been through anything like we went through that weekend.
Well, did it occur to you, as a member of this team and seeing what was confronting you, that maybe there might have been a need to develop a team that was more experienced in this kind of an investigation, or that it was necessary to turn it over to the criminal division or the FBI? And I know that you stated that at some time you didn't feel, at least immediately, that that was the case. But this is the way it turned out, isn't it?
Well, and yes, we did turn over this matter to an exceedingly large team of investigators and criminal lawyers.
Did anyone raise any concerns about the composition of the inquiry team, or as to where the investigation was being conducted?
Certainly, I have seen reports of such concerns in the media, but you mean by
In the department, by individuals in the department?
Well, not to me, no. I can't say that some weren't raised.
Someone else?
And not to my knowledge, but I previously described, I guess, a sense that I got when this matter was turned over to criminal investigators.
Well, let me ask, given the fact that there was a November 24th deadline, and knowing that you had so many documents to review, and the number of people who were involved that you had to contact and interview, didn't you consider it a problem to be able to conduct this investigation with just a few of you?
Well, I think we all appreciated this would be an arduous task with that team, but that was the team the Attorney General assembled, and we felt like it was one that was adequate to accomplishing the task. Interviewing witnesses. All of us had reasonably extensive experience in that. Mr. Reynolds certainly has a wealth of experience doing that. The Attorney General has vast experience. I even have some modest experience in terms of interviewing and deposing witnesses. So I don't think Mr. Richardson does, but that is the task that I think we thought we had to deal with at the time. It was much more like a civil discovery. That's how I looked at it, not a criminal.
Let's go on from there, Mr. Cooper. Oliver North and John Poindexter were named as possible subjects of an independent counsel inquiry as a result of a request made by the House Judiciary Committee on October 17th after the Hassenfuss crash. And the criminal division had canvassed all the components of the Department of Justice regarding North's activities, and they pursued an investigation at that time. Did you talk with the prosecutors in that case?
No, I don't believe that I did.
Did you not consider it important to do so during the course of your inquiry?
I don't think I was acquainted with these facts that you're suggesting. I'm pretty confident that I wasn't. I mean, I imagine that if all the components received a routine request for information along the lines that you've described, that my component, the Office of Legal Counsel, did, but, you know, we typically would not have anything to contribute to such a matter.
In other words, the fact that there had been an ongoing inquiry into North's activities, this was not a matter that you were supposed to be aware of, view the fact that it did relate to North, and immediately following the Hassenfuss crash.
I don't think I was aware of that. I don't think I was aware of that. Or I was aware of the Hassenfuss controversy, and I probably was aware that there was some Justice Department activity that was generated by it, but I don't recall having associated North with that.
Well, let's reflect on what you've already testified to, and as I understand it, on about November 17, 1986, prior to the weekend inquiry, you received 2 chronologies from the NSC about the Iranian arms sales. Isn't that correct?
We did receive at least 2 chronologies, yes, sir.
And you did state that you were troubled about the scarcity of information regarding the Hawk shipment. Isn't that correct?
Well, I was nagging them for information prior to the time I got the chronology, yes, pretty consistently.
And you called the Attorney General, as a matter of fact, and told him that prior involvement by the United States in Israeli shipments raised, as you said, potential legal problems. Isn't that correct?
I outlined some legal concerns that I had about that.
And on November the 20th, you met in Poindexter's office along with Attorney General Meese and Poindexter himself, Casey North, and others to review Casey's proposed testimony before the Senate. And at that time, North, who you said dominated the situation, insisted that there be a deletion of any reference to the CIA and insisted instead in inserting that there was no U.S. government knowledge at all, no U.S. government involvement.
Yes, sir.
Isn't that correct?
That is true.
And no one objected at that time concerning the North insertion and the North deletion. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And immediately after that meeting, State Department Counsel Sofer told you that not only was the testimony wrong, but that he would resign if it wasn't changed. That's correct, isn't it?
Actually, that's not the formulation, but we had a telephone conversation where that's what I discerned from it. I've testified previously as to that conversation.
Well,
yes.
let's take it from there. At this time, following all of this, number one, you were troubled by the chronologies. You had advised the Attorney General of possible legal problems, and you'd been confronted with apparently false draft testimony that you were aware of, and Sofer did make these statements, which you became aware of, that he thought that the statement was false and that he'd probably resign. How did you view these events? Were they simple mistakes? Didn't they give you some concern? Wasn't this a red flag at this time?
Yes, sir. Indeed, it was.
And wasn't this the time then to call in during the course of your inquiry?
I don't think I was acquainted with these facts that you're suggesting. I'm pretty confident that I wasn't. I mean, I imagine that if all the components received a routine request for information along the lines that you've described, that my component, the Office of Legal Counsel, did, but, you know, we typically would not have anything to contribute to such a matter.
In other words, the fact that there had been an ongoing inquiry into North's activities, this was not a matter that you were supposed to be aware of, view the fact that it did relate to North, and immediately following the Hassenfuss crash.
I don't think I was aware of that. I don't think I was aware of that. Or I was aware of the Hassenfuss controversy, and I probably was aware that there was some Justice Department activity that was generated by it, but I don't recall having associated North with that.
Well, let's reflect on what you've already testified to, and as I understand it, on about November 17, 1986, prior to the weekend inquiry, you received 2 chronologies from the NSC about the Iranian arms sales. Isn't that correct?
We did receive at least 2 chronologies, yes, sir. Ultimately.
And you did state that you were troubled about the scarcity of information regarding the Hawk shipment. Isn't that correct?
Well, I was nagging them for information prior to the time I got the chronology, yes, pretty consistently.
And you called the Attorney General, as a matter of fact, and told him that prior involvement by the United States in Israeli shipments raised, as you said, potential legal problems. Isn't that correct?
I outlined some legal concerns that I had about that.
And on November the 20th, you met in Poindexter's office along with Attorney General Meese and Poindexter himself, Casey North, and others to review Casey's proposed testimony before the Senate. And at that time, North, who you said dominated the situation, insisted that there be a deletion of any reference to the CIA and insisted instead in inserting that there was no U.S. government knowledge at all, no U.S. government involvement.
Yes, sir.
Isn't that correct?
That is true.
And no one objected at that time concerning the North insertion and the North deletion. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And immediately after that meeting, State Department Counsel Sofer told you that not only was the testimony wrong, but that he would resign if it wasn't changed. That's correct, isn't it?
Actually, that's not the formulation, but we had a telephone conversation where that's what I discerned from it. I've testified previously as to that conversation.
Well,
yes.
let's take it from there. At this time, following all of this, number one, you were troubled by the chronologies. You had advised the Attorney General of possible legal problems, and you'd been confronted with apparently false draft testimony that you were aware of, and Sofer did make these statements, which you became aware of, that he thought that the statement was false and that he'd probably resign. How did you view these events? Were they simple mistakes? Didn't they give you some concern? Wasn't this a red flag at this time?
Yes, sir. Indeed, it was.
And wasn't this the time then to call in the criminal division and others who might be better able to pursue this, or the FBI?
No, sir, not in my opinion. I can't
And you mean
imagine.
regardless of the fact that all these things were occurring and they gave you these concerns, you still did not feel it was appropriate or timely to do anything that might have immediately brought to the attention of the people what was really going on?
It was not the time to call in the FBI, no, sir, in my opinion.
You didn't you think that maybe all of this was going to be construed at some time as a possible cover-up?
Oh, that's that's precisely what I feared, and that's why I undertook measures to prevent the event from happening that I feared would happen, that inaccurate information would be shared with committees of this body. But at that time, I didn't know which story was accurate. I had reason to place credibility in the State Department story, certainly when I learned of its source first, and secondly when contemporaneous notes were alleged to exist that corroborate it. But at that moment, the important thing was to prevent what was in the offing and to discover what the truth of the matter was. There was no criminal activity. There was no hint of criminal activity. The question was, let us prevent an error from being made, and even worse, the worst spin you could put on it was that there was going to be a knowing error made with respect to the representations to Congress. But the important thing was to prevent it and find out what the facts were. The notion that the FBI would have been sent into the White House at that point, I mean, you don't...
What do you mean, prevent it? What were you going to prevent?
Going to prevent the director of the Central Intelligence Agency from expressing and relating to the Senate Intelligence Committee and the House Intelligence Committee an understanding of the facts which we no longer had confidence was true and had reason to believe it was not true. That was the critical thing to deal with at the moment.
Well, it still bothers me to think that with all that was going on at this time, talking about preventing something such as preventing false testimony from being actually produced before the Senate committee. On the other hand, there was no concern on your part that what had already taken place was something that was serious enough to call in people who were equipped to do the investigating, people such as the FBI or others.
Senator, the only thing that had taken place at that point, excuse me, Mr. Chairman Rodino, the only thing that had taken place at that point was that a draft testimony had been crafted which at worst contained an error in it which somebody knew to be an error. Now,
Are you saying that the North statement that was included was just an error?
I'm saying that the worst spin that I knew to put on this thing
But you knew there was a
was that
deletion.
somebody knew that the error was an error. That's what I'm saying. I'm not denying or saying that I didn't recognize the possibility, a distinct possibility, that those who had authored that statement knew or had reason to know that it was not accurate. I fully appreciated that possibility.
On November the 23rd, Attorney General Meese, William Reynolds, Richardson, and you interviewed North, and according to your testimony, North was surprised that the Attorney General had found a copy of the diversion memo, and North immediately asked if the Attorney General had found a cover memo. And I think when we talked about the cover memo a while ago, there was a question as to whether or not a cover memo existed. why would not a cover memo exist if Colonel North called attention to it?
I think it's very important to try to deal with this business about a cover memo based upon some of the notes that that Mr. Richardson took of our interview with North, notes which comport with my recollection of that event.
My time is slowly getting up, so will you?
Well, this is a very important point, I see.
I know it is.
Those notes, I'm sure the committee has them, but they comport with my recollection, as I say, of the questioning of Colonel North on this point. The Attorney General very methodically asked him who knew about this diversion, who might be knowledgeable in the United
Did he
States.
ask him at that time if there had been any documents which had been shredded or destroyed?
No, there was no conversation about shredding or destroying documents. But
There was no need to ask that question either?
I had no basis upon which to ask the man that question.
But you were conducting
In fact, we
an
had a
inquiry, Mr. Cooper, which was a serious inquiry, and this is the reason why I emphasize the fact that you, the three of you, who were conducting this inquiry, with all due respect to your ability as a lawyer, but none of you had that professionalism, hadn't been in the criminal division, hadn't been career employees, and certainly, while we don't want to draw any inferences, but you were political appointees, and as such were conducting this kind of an investigation, which was a very serious investigation, and which all of us continue to ask question about the president, about the presidency's knowledge, and it would seem to me that the investigation would have been better served if it had been conducted completely comprehensively.
I believe we conducted the investigation as in the circumstances and based upon the information we had as comprehensively as we could.
Is that why all of these new revelations come to the attention of this committee now, which your inquiry never revealed?
This committee's been impaneled for many weeks. It has investigators and extraordinarily skilled staff combing the country. Its deliberations have been patient and thoroughgoing. It has not confined itself to a weekend to discover all of the facts relating to this matter. I'm sure that all of the facts
Well, maybe
will
it shouldn't have
ultimately
been a
out.
weekend investigation then, Mr. Cooper.
My reference earlier to the need to disclose the Contra diversion put the end point on our investigation. But I would like to return, if I may, Congressman
Chairman,
Rodino. Mr.
my
Chairman.
time is up, but the chairman will permit.
The witness may respond.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As I mentioned earlier, the Attorney General, in his examination of Mr. North and his questioning of Mr. North, very deliberatively attempted to discern who might know of this Contra diversion in the United States government by either word of mouth or by virtue of documents which would reveal the existence of the Contra diversion. And after concluding that Mr. North had discussed the matter with no one other than McFarland and Poindexter, the Attorney General asked the questions relating to where documents might be located that would reflect this. And one thing that was unclear in our minds and which needed to be established was where this memo went, if anywhere. The memo, by the way, was a draft. It had hand strike-throughs on it. I would not expect to find a cover memo on a document of that kind, though it might certainly happen. But according to Mr. Richardson's notes and according to my memory, the Attorney General asked questions like, if the President okays something, okays a proposal in a memorandum of this kind, a copy of that would get into the working documents, the working files of the NSC, wouldn't it? And North indicated yes, that it would. He asked if the President, if RR approved it, you'd have it. You'd have a copy of this. The answer was yes. He doesn't think that it was. I think it is at that moment, at that point, in which Mr. North said, is there a cover memo with that document? I think that's when he said it. That's all I can tell you. The Attorney General continues. Are there other files that it could be in to verify that it didn't go forward? That is where Mr. North suggests he will check. But we did not discern any information beyond that with respect to any cover memos or anything. But with respect to the destruction of documents, the document we had was the best evidence they hadn't been destroying documents. Still, you know and I know that documents were destroyed. They were being shredded. They were shredded before we ever met with Colonel North, it now appears.
Those questions were never asked.
Well, that's true. That's true.